This is Counterpoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granic Allen. Today, we're digging into a new report from the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy titled More Choice, More Savings: How Educational Choice Saves Alberta Taxpayers Billions. The headline claim: school choice isn't just good for families, it's saving taxpayers serious money. According to the study, students in fully funded government schools, government fully funded schools, cost about $11,225 per year, compared to roughly $8,027 for independent schools and just $1,800 for home educated students. The authors say that adds up to more than $306 million in annual savings and $1.35 billion over 5 years for Alberta taxpayers. But that raises some big questions because for years, critics of school choice have insisted that funding independent schools drains money from the public system. This report argues that it's the exact opposite, that if those students rather were forced back into government schools, Alberta might suddenly need dozens of new schools and billions in construction costs. And there's a bigger philosophical question here as well. Who actually owns education funding? Is it the system or the families whose taxes pay for it? If parents are choosing different options and those options are cheaper for taxpayers, then the real debate isn't just about budgets. It's about whether governments should protect institutional monopolies or respect parental choice. Well, joining me now is David Hunt, Research Director with the Aristotle Foundation and co-author of the report himself. Welcome, David. Thank you so much. I really look forward to diving into this issue because this is one, I have 5 children. Many viewers have children, and some of them may be home educators. Some might be in private schools. Some might be in government schools. And I think everybody really wants to know, what the numbers tell us about school funding.
Yes, thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So let's start with that. So oftentimes, and I've experienced this as a mother, probably even as a student when I was younger, that students, when they're not in the system, they're taking away from the system. Private schools are a problem. Independent schools are a problem. And God help those homeschoolers; they're the worst. Why does this narrative exist, and how does that reflect, and how is that existing vis-a-vis the reality?
Yeah, I think in terms of why that narrative exists, I think the teachers' unions have a self-interested perspective where if there are any schools or any students who aren't contributing to union dues, they're obviously going to have a reaction to that. So I think the claims against independent schools and home education are from very self-interested sources. But if we just break it down, very simple terms that all of us can understand, if we're paying full price for students to go to public or separate schools versus we're only paying a partial amount to support them in independent schools, the taxpayer savings are obvious. We've run the numbers. People can get into the details of the report. But bottom line, you're saving in Alberta $3,200 per student. You spread that out. You already gave some of the numbers, but just think in terms of capacity. If you didn't have this funding, most of these students wouldn't be in independent schools because these are middle class families that cannot afford to pay elite private schools. Not 9% of the schools are quote unquote elite independent schools in Ontario. So if you didn't have this funding, you'd have to have so many more schools. I think the number that we calculated is 54 new schools when 37 new schools are already on the docket. So put that together, was that 91 schools that you would need? And given that it takes a decade plus to get a school built, it's really not realistic to pull this funding, at least not in Alberta.
Right.
And their savings being realized regardless.
Okay, so one question that has always perturbed me is, how did governments get into the business of education? I know the history that it was a lot of Christian missionaries and Catholic, Sisters of St. Joseph and Jesuits, et cetera, open up these private schools. And it sounded more like religious institutions were at the helm of these schools. But how did the government take over?
So we don't have time to fully unpack it. Short version. There's a consensus within society that the education of the neighbor's kids or the lack thereof affects all of us.
Right.
So there's an understanding, and again, we can debate the philosophy here, but the consensus is that the education of the neighbor's kids or lack thereof is not merely a private interest, it's a societal interest. Therefore, education has a public interest. But then where I would push back on that consensus is I would argue that's not a case for a one size fits all model, because if the education of the neighbor's kid matters so much, why would we not allow funding to follow that student to the school where they learn best and where they're going to excel and where they're going to thrive? And that's where I think, given the consensus around education, that's actually an argument I would argue in favor of school choice, letting those resources follow students, supporting families in whatever school is the best fit for them.
Okay, we're going to pick this up in just a moment. Welcome back. Joining me again is David Hunt, Research Director with the Aristotle Foundation and co-author of this excellent report discussing public school funding and whether we are spending more if we have kids in the system or kids leaving the system in independent schools, homeschooling, etc. And this report is titled More Choice, More Savings, How Educational Choice Saves Alberta Taxpayers Billions. Again, your headline on this piece really piqued my interest, so I'm excited to have you on, David. Thanks again. So before the commercial break, we're discussing, how the government is in the business of education. So, we have these policies. Of course, I doubt you'd find a probably human in the country who doesn't believe there should be some baseline general educational, standard to hit, and that the government understands that. But they're also executing the policy, meaning they're delivering education. Uh, but like you suggested, some schools some students may be better served with a special school of, say, for the arts, or a school that focuses more on this, or maybe can address certain developmental challenges that a certain child faces, versus a one size fits all system. We use that dirty word voucher, and people get all triggered when they hear this. So why don't we have a voucher system? Why doesn't the money, the government funding, follow the student and not just blanketly sent to schools?
The very simple answer is the teachers unions. Their advocacy is extraordinarily effective. Their lobbying is second to none. And given the billions of dollars they have behind them, and of course, there's a monopolistic dynamic there. With if you're going to be teaching in the public school system, you don't have an option. You have to be part of these unions. So that's the simple answer. Now, in terms of vouchers and the details of that, there's a lot there to unpack policy wise. A voucher specifically, technically, there's a lot of limitations to that, but very simply, in the province where I am, British Columbia, every single student is accounted for. There's a dollar amount allocated to each student. So, from a public policy perspective, it would not be onerous to allow that funding to follow, not necessarily in a voucher form. You could have a debit account where an account is set up for each and every student for to be spent on appropriate educational expenditures,
Mhm.
and where if there were any issues, the government obviously would have the right to audit that account, but we would presume innocence and we presume it's being put to good uses. But then with those dollars, whether those dollars are being used for independent school or whether for private tutoring, especially with students who have various special needs, to have tutoring or what have you, the ultimate education is one-on-one. The research on that is overwhelming. And now it's not realistic for every student to have a one-on-one tutor necessarily, but when you think about how much we're spending on each student, so take the province of Alberta, the focus of this study, it's over just the per student cost. So we're not looking at capital expenditures. Most of the line items have been excluded from that per student amount, because what we're trying to get at is if there's a migration within the system. So you shut down all the independent schools, you have a law that forces all the
Right?
homeschoolers into public schools. What's that going to cost the public? That's what we're trying to get at. So this is not a grand total. This is the very specific per student allocations. That number is at over $11,000 in Alberta. And Alberta,
Yes.
if I'm not mistaken, has the least funding per student of all the provinces. So $11,000. So anyone who's a homeschool parent, what can be done with $11,000? You actually could afford
Wow.
a one-on-one tutor for every single student. So that's the ultimate education experience. Where again, the research is overwhelming. That's the best way to educate is one-on-one. And if you want a good anecdote from history, Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle, right? That actually, and people may think that's crazy, but it's not, because at eleven
No, that's
thousand dollars,
yeah, because I mean,
yeah,
you mentioned Aristotle. I mean, we talk about the concept of Socratic dialogue and how that helps the mind, you getting these discussions and having that Socratic dialogue. Absolutely. It's a great form. It's a great tool within education.
Yeah, and so I think the question the public needs to ask is, are we getting bang for buck in the education system? And when you see failing outcomes, whether it's mathematics, whether it's reading, whether it's writing, in your province of Ontario, the right to read report, the right to read inquiry was absolutely damning. If I'm not mistaken, from memory, I think a third of students can't read by the end of grade three, which the understanding in the field is if you can't read by the end of grade three, you're not going to read till you're an adult and figure it out for yourself because you'll
Mm,
just get passed through the system. So that's
right.
1 in 3 kids in the Ontario education system cannot read.
Okay, I'm going to pause you there. We'll pick this up in just a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by David Hunt, Research Director with the Aristotle Foundation, as we discuss his latest report that he co-authored discussing school funding and student funding. Again, thanks again, David, for joining me. When we look at the numbers, and again, based on the Alberta model, publicly or fully funded students cost over $11,000 per year in government taxpayer funded, versus say $1,800 for home educated students, or even $8,000 for independent school or private school students. I mean, that's a staggering gap of efficiency, shall we say. What explains this gap? Why does it cost so much more for fully funded students?
The simplest answer is independent schools are profoundly accountable to parents. So if you're paying tuition out of pocket and you're also paying the property taxes for that you're forced to pay for all education, and only part of that is coming back to your school. If you're paying tuition, the school better be delivering on that, and there better be a very high quality education. During the COVID lockdowns, we did a couple studies on the independent school response to the crisis compared to public schools. And actually, in your province of Ontario, there were almost no days missed of education. And in terms of the online experience for the independent schools in your province, yes, it was difficult. Yes, it was challenging. Yes, there was a lot to work through, but you don't see the same drawdown in
Right.
learning outcomes that you saw in the public system because of that accountability, and how much more so in the homeschool space, where the kids can't hide. Mom and dad are going to make sure if you didn't do your math assignment today, mom or dad will be following up on that. Unlike in the school system, where parents very often assume their kids are being educated, they assume their kids can read, they assume their kids are numerate, and in many cases, that is a false assumption, and we have good data on that.
So if school choice and uh, yeah, school choice is becoming more increasingly popular with parents, which your evidence suggests it is. Why, again, is there such intense resistance to expanding it? Is it really the lockdown by the teachers unions? Do they literally govern the public policy of the province of Alberta?
Govern no, but pressure yes. And anytime you do anything that they're not happy with, whoever's in government and whoever those politicians are, they will feel the pressure. I think there's no place that's a better example of that than your province with Doug Ford. Doug Ford has made almost no progress on school choice, despite overwhelming evidence. The research has been presented to him, has been presented to cabinet, those around him. He is well aware of all this information, and yet he's made no movement whatsoever. Why? The only explanation I have is he fears the reaction of the public sector unions. Now, not that that's his voter base, so I would say it's an irrational justification, but that is the explanation. You will feel that pressure, and their arsenal is billions of dollars. So the slander campaign against you
Right.
will be intense. And in Alberta, you have some leadership that's not afraid of that.
Yeah, and I've seen, when it's election period, a lot of the teachers unions do come out with a lot of politically geared ads. One of them is that like only, and we touched upon this, that the private schools or whatever, they only serve elites. But your report suggests that that funding model actually reduces the burden on taxpayers overall. How how does your data support that actually independent schools and private schools, they're actually not elitists, and the average man actually wants to access that?
Yes, so there's been a number of studies on this. I did a pan Canadian study, would have been in 2019 and 2020, looking at who chooses independent schools and why do they make those choices. And when you get a large sample, representative sample of who those families are, you realize these are middle class, and however we want to define middle class, whether we're going to define it by income, whether we're going to define it by occupation, and the types of jobs that they do. These are very much middle class families. Now, there are, of course, in every province, elite schools, your top tier schools. That's not a bad thing. We need heart surgeons, we need rocket scientists, and yes, they disproportionately come out of those schools because the chances are the parents of the rocket scientists and the heart surgeons are sending their kids to those schools. That's not a bad thing. You need that within society, but it's such a small share. In every province, it's not that different. In Alberta, that's what's fresh in my mind because that's what we put in this study. It's not 9% of of the independent space could be categorized that as top tier elite schools. So it's a tiny sliver, but of course that's the talking point used by those opposed to any funding for independent schools. I don't want my money going to these elitist institutions. It's a small sliver. For most of them, what's motivating them, about 60% of these schools are religious in some respect.
Right.
So various religious denominations, and or about half of them are special emphasis schools, as we talked about earlier, whether special needs or Montessori or classical, etc.
Okay, we're going to pick this up in just a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by David Hunt, Research Director with the Aristotle Foundation, as we discuss school funding, and we're looking at Alberta specifically. So, David, let's forecast 10 to 20 years from now. If the current projections and trends continue the way they are, with more and more parents seeking out independent schools or home education, etc., what does this mean for, say, the fiscal health of fully funded public schools? Uh, could school choice become for Alberta one of the biggest cost containment strategies?
That's a very good way of framing it, Tanya. I like that wording, and yes, that is accurate. In that, if we look at the increase in enrollment versus the increase in costs in the public system. Now, there's been good discipline within Alberta. Things aren't out of control, and that's definitely not the case in every province. But you've had enrollment and education costs roughly increase at about the same rate, whereas with independent schools, enrollment is increasing at a faster rate than the costs are. Something like enrollment is increasing about 35% faster than costs are increasing, and of course that much more so in the home education space, where it's probably a factor of 5 in terms of how fast enrollment is growing versus the burden on the taxpayer, because there's a small amount, it's about $1,800 a student that the Alberta the public purse gives to home ed students. So again, you work that out over years. Now, in this study we weren't modeling out into the future. We were looking at actual costs to date, therefore actual savings. So the savings realized from independent and home ed over the last 10 years, that is equivalent to the entire capital plan for the Alberta Ministry of Education for the entire province for the next 3 years. So you think of where the money has come from to build new public schools and to upgrade public schools. That money has come from independent enrollment, home enrollment, and because you see growth in those spaces, the savings realized is growing.
Absolutely. And in Ontario, for example, because I believe there's a homeschool credit given to home educators in Alberta, is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, it is a bit more complex than that, but yes, but on average, it's about 1,800 per student. Typically, because what you have is 98% of home educated students are enrolled in some schools. For some, it's
Right.
public schools or separate schools. For many or most, it's independent schools, but they are technically supervised by those schools, and with that, there are resources attached to that, and of course, there's an accountability
Right.
attached to that. So that's baked into the whole Alberta system, is that funds and accountability go hand in hand.
Yeah. So that doesn't exist in Ontario. So that number of how much a homeschooler costs the public system is zero. So like the disparity is actually it's quite stark. Okay.
But Tanya, if I could jump
Yeah.
in
Go for it.
there, there that's actually a disservice to Ontario. And if there was some funding there, you would see a great increase in enrollment. So there would be the irony is, by giving a little bit to the home educated families, you'd actually be saving a significant amount of money, given what the per student amount is for public school students and for families that they could transition from one system to the other. The irony is, by giving homeschoolers money, you would be saving money in Ontario.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and maybe we'll expand that out when we have you on again next time because that's very interesting. So, based on your research, what, in your opinion, is the most practical policy Alberta could implement, say tomorrow, and that would say expand educational choice, but also still protect the taxpayers? Because this is obviously, there's a disparity financially here.
So I think practical is the word I'm going to jump in on. In terms of practical, let's assume that's politically feasible, something you could actually pull off tomorrow, as the other word you used. So practical tomorrow. I actually think the Alberta government's doing it. After the study was released, which was quite recently, there is new legislation now being put forward to provide not a large amount, but some capital funding for these independent schools, because what we also know, and this wasn't reported in the study because it was beyond the scope, are the wait lists that these independent schools have. Most of them have very long wait lists,
Yes.
but they don't have the money to expand. Fundraising for a new building or an expansion is a major endeavor. Again, these are middle school families, middle class families with limited means. So that's a practical piece of legislation that's being put forward right now in Alberta to increase school choice in that province.
Wow. Okay. Well, listen, David, thank you so much for this information. We'll have to follow up with you again in the future because I can see this is a very much a moving issue. So appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tanya.
That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to suggest a topic for the show, feel free to reach out via X at Granic Allen or via the Newsform website. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.